All right, today we're jumping into a really interesting topic by summarizing some arguments from the podcast series, The Queer Christian. We're going to be looking at two specific verses from the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament. Now, these are often called clobber verses, and for a long time, they've been the foundation for condemning same-sex relationships. But this source we're exploring offers a very different way to look at them. So let's start by looking at the verses themselves. Okay, so first up, we've got Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22. It reads, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination." Pretty straightforward, right? I mean, on the surface, it seems like a very clear, direct prohibition. This verse has been a cornerstone for traditional views for centuries.
And it doesn't stop there. Just a couple chapters later, in chapter 20, the same idea is repeated, but this time it adds a pretty severe consequence. Quote, "They shall be put to death." Whoa. So when you just read these two verses by themselves, in English, they seem incredibly direct and damning.
And you can see why, for a lot of people, that's pretty much the end of the discussion, right? Case closed. But the argument from our source material today asks a really important question. What happens when we zoom out? What's the bigger picture that these verses are actually a part of? So let's do exactly that. Let's pull back the lens a bit. Because here's the thing. These verses don't just exist in a vacuum. They're part of a much larger, ancient legal document called the Holiness Code, which was written for a very specific group of people in a very specific time in history.
And this is absolutely crucial to the whole argument. These aren't two standalone commandments just dropped from the sky. Nope, they are just two little entries in a long, super detailed list of rules that covered almost every part of ancient Israelite life, from what you could eat to what you could wear to how you farmed.
And we're not talking about a handful of rules here. The sheer scale is, well, it's massive. We're talking about over 70 different laws. This wasn't just a simple list of do's and don'ts. It was the entire framework for their society.
And this is where it gets really fascinating, because you start to see what else is on this list. For example, Leviticus says you can't eat shrimp or pork. You can't wear a shirt made of a cotton polyblend. You can't even trim your beard. It also gives the death penalty for cursing at your parents or for working on a Saturday. But at the same time, it commands that foreigners must be treated just like native-born citizens. It's a really complex mix.
So all of this leads to a really big question, and this is the core of the source material's argument. If all these rules come from the exact same holiness code, why are these two verses about same-sex acts treated like timeless universal moral laws, while almost all the others are just dismissed as being culturally specific and, not for us today?
Okay, check this out. It's a fantastic example. The rule about men lying with men is in chapter 18. Just one chapter later, we get the rule against trimming beards. So why is one treated like this unbreakable moral law for all time, while the other is so totally ignored that, let's be honest, many churches probably prefer a nicely trimmed beard?
Or how about this one, which is even more stark? The very same chapter, chapter 20, that calls for the death penalty for men lying together, also calls for the death penalty for anyone who curses their parents. And yet, you would have a very hard time finding anyone today who thinks that's a good idea. This selective application is what the source calls cherry-picking.
And, the inconsistency gets even weirder. I mean, think about it. Many people who hold up this verse as a timeless moral law are only applying the first half of it, the part that condemns the act. They totally ignore the second half that demands the death penalty. That's a huge inconsistency inside a single sentence.
All right, so that's the whole consistency issue. But there's another huge piece to this puzzle, the language itself. The argument here is that a key word, a really important word at the heart of these verses, might not mean what we all think it means today.
And it all hinges on one single powerful word, abomination. We hear that word and it sounds really, really bad, like a deep moral evil. But the question is, what did the original Hebrew word, toeba, actually mean to the people who first heard it?
Well, according to our source, this is where things get lost in translation. Toeba, it turns out, was more of a technical term. It didn't always mean something was inherently sinful or evil. Often, it just meant something was ritually or culturally unclean for the ancient Israelites. For example, eating pork was a toeba. Wearing that polycotton blend was a toeba. The focus was all about maintaining this state of ritual purity.
So you might be asking, why all this focus on being ritually pure? Well, the argument is that it was all about identity. The Holiness Code was basically designed to make the nation of Israel distinct, to set them apart from their pagan neighbors in Canaan. And these neighbors were known for practices like temple prostitution, both heterosexual and homosexual, which the Israelites were commanded to stay far away from.
And this all leads up to a major theological turning point. The source we're looking at cites Dr. Ralph Blair, a theologian who argues that this entire system of ritual purity was essentially wiped away with the New Covenant in the New Testament. The argument is that both Jesus and the Apostle Paul completely rejected these kinds of ritual distinctions between what's clean and unclean, and instead focused on what's going on in a person's heart.
Okay, so let's step back and look at what we've got. When you put all these pieces on the table, the huge and mostly ignored context of the Holiness Code, the really inconsistent way it's applied, and the disputed translation of that key word, the source argues that the traditional interpretation starts to look like it's standing on very shaky ground.
So let's just lay out the three core arguments that are really chipping away at that traditional view. First, the verses are yanked out of their original legal and cultural context. Second, their application is incredibly inconsistent when you look at all the other laws in the exact same code. And third, the translation of that central word, abomination, is very much up for debate.
And this all leads to a really powerful image the source uses to wrap this all up. A house of cards. With the context missing, the consistency gone, and the translation challenged, the entire argument built on Leviticus becomes, in this view, a house of cards. You pull out any one of those pieces, and the whole thing just collapses.
And that leaves us with this final, really thought-provoking question. What changes in our understanding when we start to view ancient rules not as this flat list of timeless commands for everybody, but as complex ideas that were products of their own specific time and their own specific place? That was a summary of arguments from the podcast series The Queer Christian by Elton Sherwin, which is available on most podcast services.